Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Lucas Vasquez from the Minnesota Daily, and welcome back to another episode of In the Know, a podcast dedicated to the University of Minnesota. Today, we are diving into the world of social media, specifically its emphasis on short-form content. As someone who spends a good amount of time on Instagram Reels, I began to think about how Gen Z is consuming more media daily than ever seen before. Then, I began to wonder, what does routine consumption of rapid-fire content do to our brains? How does it change the way we learn, form ideas, and think critically? To try and answer this question, I sat down with a student and researchers at the university to understand how short-form media is reshaping the modern mind. First, I learned about why we scroll as much as we do.
We forget that it's like a quick little dopamine hit. So every time you see a little video that 10, 15 seconds, you get a quick little message and you go to the next one. And before you even swipe the next one, it takes you to the next one. So you don't have to make the decision.
That's Margaret Ortman. She is the university's director of the School of Counseling and a professor of educational psychology. What she's describing is an intentional psychological design. The platforms we use aren't neutral. They are engineered to keep us hooked. This phenomenon is so prevalent that the National Library of Medicine has given it the name dopamine scrolling. I spoke with Angelica Pazurek, a professor at the College of Education and Human Development, and she elaborated on how dopamine scrolling becomes a habit.
That we're constantly scrolling because the social media and the apps and the technology devices, both hardware and software that we use, are designed to intentionally be sort of addicting, to keep us scrolling, that constant dopamine hit. So the designers, the technology companies, the developers, they know that about humans. They want you coming back to their app, their platform, their device.
And it isn't just that these platforms are addictive, they're actively changing our brain's mechanisms for how we process information. When we consume media in these rapid bursts, it can lead to what educational psychologists call cognitive overload. Essentially, the sheer volume of rapid-fire content crowds our working memory, making it incredibly difficult to actually retain what we are seeing. To break down exactly what happens to our brains during this process, I spoke with Martin Van Boekel, a professor in the university's Department of Educational Psychology. They explained that the ease of scrolling actually tricks us into a false sense of security about what we are learning.
Learning happens best when we struggle with the information a little bit. It's called desirable difficulty. It's the way I like to frame it when I'm talking about it in my classes. And when we struggle a little bit, not so hard that we can't possibly do it, because then we're not learning, we're just frustrated. When we have this sort of level of desirability, we're going to form those connections in these really powerful ways. Now, when information is presented to us in a way that's super digestible and it's interesting, we see it as, there's again air quotes there, we see it as interesting because it's tailored to our interests. So of course we see it as interesting in these short form videos. The ease at which we process that information, it may feel like we're learning, just like at that direct lecture class where it sounds like, oh yeah, I knew this all along, right? It's so easily just sort of heard, and that we get overconfident that we learned this information. But then when the reality is 2 days later when I have to go recall that, because I didn't work with it, because I didn't try to make those connections and make sense of this, it just felt like it just clicked. It's kind of hanging around in brain space, just really difficult to retrieve.
The algorithm hands us clips that are both easily digestible and tailored to our interests. As a result, our brains don't do the heavy lifting required to lock that information into our long-term memory. Van Boekel said that psychologists study this using the forgetting curve, which shows that within just 24 hours of passively taking in information, without actively reusing it, we lose about 60% of what we consumed. To see how this plays out in real life, I wanted to hear a student's perspective. Sawyer Henry is a third-year dual political science and journalism major here at the university. He said that while he caught himself in doom-scrolling loops, the content rarely left a lasting impression.
Most of the stuff that I think that we see when we're scrolling is so not noteworthy at all. Things that you do remember are it's kind of like a dream. If it makes you feel some kind of intense emotion, then surely you're going to remember it maybe the next morning and then forget about it. But I wouldn't say I remember everything, especially a lot of it's just advertisements these days.
This lack of information retention is exactly what has sparked the popular rhetoric that Gen Z's attention spans are ruined, and that our capacity for critical thinking is less than that of past generations. But is that the whole story? Or is Gen Z's way of thinking simply evolving to match our environment? When I brought this up to Pazurek, she pushed back against the moral panic.
I'm more interested in pushing back against that rhetoric to say that there are positive implications about the ways that young people are using and engaging with technology today. There's lots of research to support that. So others like me in my field of learning science and educational technology or learning technologies make an important distinction between critical thinking and critical theorizing or critical engagement.
She said it's important to understand that from a learning science perspective, there is a difference between these two concepts.
So critical thinking as an educational theory refers to this intellectually disciplined process of actively conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating information. And it helps us make more informed, evidence-based decisions. So we can learn how to do that, and we can learn how to do that more effectively through resources, whether those resources be online or offline resources. We tend to spend a lot of time online today. That's just the nature of our world, especially in the U.S. I'm an American, so I'll talk about U.S. context and U.S. culture. But it's really important to understand that there's potential and possibilities to learn to be a better critical thinker. And also it's important to think about that as being limited because of the way that critical thinking has been framed as kind of an individual process. Because it tends to be very self-referential, like I'm a critical thinker, I'm critically thinking about, fill in the blank. But when we frame that as a personal attribute and as kind of a neutral tool of thinking, that where we can be like objective in our critical thinking, that obscures lots of things, because our critical thinking, our thinking in general, our understanding, and our learning is all influenced by more than just what happens in our mind.
She argued that it's important to take into consideration the social factors that influence our thinking.
So things like, the social, the cultural, the historical, and the political conditions under which we think, where we're thinking, how we're thinking, and what we're thinking about. So now I'll move that a little bit further along that kind of continuum to think about critical engagement or critical theorizing. And that's very different than critical thinking. So I encourage students in my classes to learn how to be critical thinkers, but also to be critical theorists, to think more critically about those social, historical, political influences on what we do, how we see things, our assumptions, our norms, our values, our behaviors, all of those things. So critical engagement and critical theorizing is more than just critical thinking, and it involves sort of wider structures of power, inequality, ideologies that shape our knowledge and that shape everyday life. So critical theory refers to a way of doing philosophically that involves kind of a critique of culture, and it offers critiques of traditional views and assumptions, including views and assumptions about critical thinking, how that's a self-referential process, and how it's really sort of only happens in the mind. So we're situated in society, in cultures. All of those things need to be included when we're talking about critical thinking or critical engagement.
Pazurek's distinction between critical thinking versus critical theorizing highlights something important. Gen Z isn't experiencing a simple decline in cognitive ability. Instead, our learning styles are actively adapting to the cultural landscape around us. Rather than framing technology as purely detrimental, Pazurek's research points towards how modern technology offers us unique competencies. Henry noted a similar sentiment. He emphasized that being immersed in a heavy digital culture doesn't compromise a student's individual critical thought. In fact, it often forces students to become hyper-aware of how corporate and algorithmic spaces try to filter reality.
I do try to be very aware of the way I consume media and very critical of the way I interpret it. I think that more people need to be taught how to recognize fallacies and rhetoric in a more nuanced way, but I definitely do think I'm more aware of it because I catch a lot of, especially you see this in the poli-sci department, you catch a lot of people forming their thoughts and opinions off of what they see out in social media, and then that shapes the way that they think a lot. And I, as someone who's very critical of that, and as someone who promotes the idea of just thinking with nuance, just basic nuance, I feel like I try and stray away from that as much as I can. And I do try and be aware of the way that I interact with things online does impact my algorithm.
This awareness is vital because, as Van Boekel notes, when we become too passive in our consumption of media, we open ourselves up to algorithmic traps that are specifically constructed to target us.
It makes us sense that we're processing this information really, really clearly, or making all these connections, but we're probably not making them as strong. But that's just a hypothesis, because there's something magic in these algorithms. I mean, those people that develop these things are hired in cognitive psychologists, social psychologists to trap us. So they know.
Beyond platforms as engineered algorithms, the content we consume is heavily weighted by emotional hooks. Van Boekel explained how this constant stream of emotionally charged material directly interacts with our long-term memory. This process creates fragmented but lasting ideas.
We may not be getting the full picture when we're doom scrolling, because we're just looking at the headlines and just getting things that get us worked up. But we're going to remember those things partially. And that's probably part of the problem, is that we don't get the full story. But there's something really powerful in those particularly negatively charged things as far as memory goes. They stick. And they can be pulled up every time we get emotionally negatively charged, because those conditions align and that sparks.
This discussion can also be observed in the classroom. Because of the anxiety surrounding this generational technological shift and the rise of artificial intelligence, academia has found itself at a crossroads. Many educators have chosen a reactive path. Some are making strict bans on new digital media and pushing for a return to traditional analog teaching methods. But when I presented this concept to Ortman, she argued that a total prohibition is not only ineffective, but entirely unrealistic in a world where technology is the new norm. Ortman shared that trying to separate students from the digital world usually results in the exact opposite of its intended effect.
This may not be a popular opinion with my fellow educators, but I always say the same thing: it's moderation. As educators, we have to work with it, not against it. Whether it's AI, whether it's, the list could go on. But I think it's teaching yourself, how do I use it in a way, how to become a critical thinker. The DARE program didn't work in schools because of no drugs. You say no, people are going to want it more. So it's with technology, it's it's not going away, it's going to be here. So why don't we use it as a tool to help us?
Ortman practices what she preaches. She actively structures her curriculum around digital interaction rather than trying to impose a more traditional paper-only approach.
This past summer, I taught a midterm class, and I require my students to use technology in every presentation. If you're going to work with children on lessons, you need to have technology, have videos, you need to get them engaged, move around. You can't just sit there and talk on a PowerPoint anymore. That's not how they learn. That's not what they know.
Pazurek echoed this philosophy, noting that closing the classroom door to digital spaces doesn't protect students, it actually compromises their professional futures.
Forcing students to do anything or not do anything is ill-advised. I also believe that it's not possible to learn about the practical uses of technology, regardless of what that technology is, without actually authentically using the technology. So if we close the door to social media and learning and how it can be used in higher ed, or AI and how it can be used for learning in higher ed, if we're closing the door to that, it really limits the educational opportunity. Because if we ban things in the classroom, when students leave our classroom or they graduate from our academic programs, how will they make informed, ethical decisions about whether or not to use AI or any other technology throughout their career? They need to be empowered to use their agency, to make informed decisions, to be informed consumers and ethical producers of new media in all its forms.
Ultimately, this shift forces us to re-examine the foundational goals of education itself. Van Boekel left me with a vital critique, asking us to look past the simple efficiency and examine the motives of both corporate tech platforms and modern educational design.
People stay hooked and interested on social media and short form videos. So let's do that. Let's bring more computer, more short form video into classroom. We're trying to make these crossovers. And this is why this is really important. It's how much is learning, how much is lost. And it all comes down to capitalism and education. Can we commodify these things? And that's a dangerous place. Also, from my perspective, is the goal of education and learning in general to be an efficient system? And I would argue, and I think I do this in all my classes, is that no, I don't think learning is an efficient process. And I think efforts to make it more efficient to a degree is important. We want to support everyone, but what's the end point of efficiency in learning and in education? It's so that we can be more productive earners in this rat race of capitalism. And it's like, well, is that the goal? That's a really, in my mind, gross goal to be working towards. It's problematic for the humans. It's problematic for the environment. It's problematic for a lot of our health, all of these different things. But I think those are the questions we need to come into learning. It's like, how are all these things interconnected so that we can better understand, well, why do we care? Because we know why the social media companies care. We know why they invest in the algorithms. It's because they make billions of dollars. Why would a teacher care, or an educational researcher care about porting this over? Like, what is value gains? What are the value losses in those spaces? So, like, I think we, as we study these things, we need to come from an ultra critical perspective to make sure we're doing things carefully and for the right reasons.
Van Boekel's critique strikes at the heart of the issue. When we look past the surface of our screens, we find that the conversation surrounding short-form media isn't just about attention spans or classroom politics. It's about recognizing the wider structures that dictate how information is built and distributed. What makes Gen Z's relationship with social media unique is that they are the first generation that has truly never had the option to ignore the digital world. As Ortman highlighted during our conversation, past generations had the ability to opt out. If a college student in the 1990s or early 2000s wanted to avoid the noise of the world, they could choose not to pick up a newspaper or switch off the news channel on a television set. Today, that barrier is gone. The digital landscape is immersive and inescapable. The moment we check our phones, headlines, videos, articles, and highly polarizing viewpoints are aggressively pushed onto our fields of view. The challenges facing modern education, and this generation as a whole, isn't solely about shortening or lengthening attention spans, nor is it about trying to slow down the use of technology in our daily lives. It ultimately comes down to standard digital literacy. The challenge is to move past passive repetitive consumption and instead to intentionally use the muscle we call our brain and critically evaluate and critique the information in front of us. The ultimate potential of technology today depends entirely on how we choose to use it. Each of us has the ability to make conscious choices about our habits. We could allow the algorithm to select our content and shape our opinions for us. Or we can actively seek out diverse ideas to come to more complete conclusions, and in doing so, hopefully, make all of us better informed people. Thank you for listening. This episode was written by Lucas Vasquez and produced by Grace Agner. If you would like to share your opinion on the topics discussed today, you can email us at podcasting@mndaily.com. Thank you again for tuning in. My name is Lucas Vasquez, and this has been In the Know.